On this episode of the Debrief, we're going to be looking at post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic growth. These are two topics that I'm extremely passionate about because, as you might imagine, each incident we cover on the Debrief has had a profound effect on everyone involved. Over the years that I've been working with teams and the years that I've hosted this show, I've seen people destroyed by their experiences. Yet I've also seen others use the trauma they endured to build a stronger, happier, and more purposeful version of themselves. Although I've certainly seen patterns, I've always wondered what separated these two groups of people, which is why I wanted to have this discussion on post-traumatic growth. Simply put, there is a lot we can do to prepare for and respond to traumatic incidents that will reduce the fallout for those involved. All of my guests today have a different perspective on post-traumatic growth. Dr. Richard Tedeschi is the world's foremost authority on post-traumatic growth and literally coined the expression. His work forms the foundation for most PTG programs. Josh Goldberg is the CEO of Boulder Crest Foundation, a nonprofit whose Warrior Path and Struggle Well programs have reached over 100,000 people. And finally, Chief Chad Kasmar is the current Chief of Police in Tucson, Arizona. Following the suicide of a friend and former fellow officer, Chad has led a revolution in the way his city prepares and supports their staff for traumatic incidents. He has a unique perspective on the implementation of these types of programs. I hope you enjoy this deep dive into post-traumatic growth and that this episode inspires you and your agencies to improve on the way we prepare and treat our warriors and first responders. My name is John Becker. For the past 4 decades, I've dedicated my life to protecting tactical operators. During this time, I've worked with many of the world's top law enforcement and military units. As a result, I've had the privilege of working with the amazing leaders who take teams into the world's most dangerous situations. The goal of this podcast is to share their stories in hopes of making us all better leaders, better thinkers, and better people. Welcome to the Debrief. My first guest is Dr. Richard Tedeschi. Dr. Tedeschi is the world's foremost authority on post-traumatic growth and leads the Boulder Crest Institute, where he develops innovative programs helping combat veterans and first responders transform trauma into strength. His groundbreaking work has been recognized among the top 2% of the world's most cited research by Stanford University. Dr. Tedeschi's academic contributions are remarkable. During his 42-year tenure as a professor of psychological science at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, he and colleague Dr. Lawrence Calhoun established the first laboratory dedicated to studying how people change positively through trauma. They coined the term post-traumatic growth in 1995, pioneering an entirely new field of psychological research. For their outstanding scholarship, they received the prestigious First Citizens Bank Scholars Medal. Dr. Tedeschi has authored 10 influential books on post-traumatic growth and has translated decades of academic research into practical applications that are changing lives. Since 2014, he has worked to establish Boulder Crest as the center of post-traumatic growth work, developing peer-based approaches that make this powerful framework accessible to those who serve our communities. A fellow of the American Psychological Association's Division of Trauma Psychology and frequent media consultant on trauma and resilience, Dr. Tedeschi brings unparalleled expertise in helping individuals not just recover from trauma, but actually grow through their experiences. Rich, thanks so much for being here with me.
My pleasure.
Why don't we start with kind of how you got interested in post-traumatic stress and kind of post-trauma?
Well, actually, I didn't start there. I started with a question about how people become wise. I was interested in that. And so this was back in the 1980s. And my colleague, this was at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, where I was teaching with Lawrence Calhoun, my colleague. And so we were interested in that question. And we decided to talk to people who had been through difficult situations in life, thinking that maybe those are the people who learned something from those encounters with difficulty in life. So we started doing interviews with people. The first ones we did were with people who had suffered some kind of physical disabilities in adulthood, become paralyzed, blinded, that sort of thing. And got in touch with people who had done well, who had been sort of the stars of rehabilitation in our area where we're working. So we just interviewed and sat down and recorded their stories and what had happened to them over the time from before their injuries and what had happened to them and what happened afterwards and where they came to some point where they thought of life differently and sometimes made remarkable changes in themselves in the aftermath of these events. So that's where we started.
So then what did you find?
Well, we found that people told us some things that surprised us in some ways. For example, about a quarter of the people we interviewed said that these things that most people think were terrible were the best things that ever happened to them. And they explained why, because they led them to change their lives in ways they now valued, and they realized they wouldn't have gotten there otherwise unless they had to go through some different doors that opened to them as a result of these experiences, because other doors had been closed as a result of these experiences. So there's that.
So they viewed it as transformative.
Absolutely. So that, in fact, that was the first time we wrote a book on that. We titled it Trauma and Transformation. So that was the title of the first book we wrote on that.
Interesting. Yeah, because you see that, right? You see people that are destroyed by it and you see people that are transformed by it. I was thinking of like a chrysalis and a butterfly kind of relationship. Yeah. So you start to notice that pattern. What then leads you to continue researching that?
Well, because it's, first of all, just listening to the stories of people is a fascinating thing.
I understand.
You understand that. Yeah. So that's a good thing. And then the other thing is you just learn so much about living life from these people. They're great teachers. If you listen and you have that approach where you think you're going to learn something rather than thinking you know it all already.
Yeah.
So that's just carried me through all these years continuing to do this work.
So you've done this now for 40 years and I think are regarded as one of the originators of the idea behind post-traumatic growth. Versus, I think originally the positioning of, you had post-traumatic stress disorder, which sounds hopeless and dead-endish. And I think your early work and current work focuses more on that transformation and post-traumatic growth. At what point did you start to think of it that way? Like, how did it evolve in your thinking?
Well, first of all, it took us about 10 years before we actually came up with the term.
Sure.
After we started this whole project. It in some ways it was obvious early. We went to the literature and read a lot of literature on trauma and aftermath of trauma and how people cope with trauma and all of that. And typically what you find, as you mention, is a lot of disorder and symptoms and all of that sort of thing. But you also find these exceptions to that rule, that supposed rule. And there were stories in the literature that we read about and found that indicated that there was another part of this that people were sometimes mentioning but never followed up on. So we decided we were gonna look at that part that people were not paying close enough attention to. So that's where we found a lot of unexplored territory.
And so now looking back, doing the work you're currently working, I would love to dig into kind of what happens after a traumatic event and also kind of what defines that line between, what you're debilitated by it and you grow from it. Why don't we start with when I'm exposed to a traumatic event, something happens to me. I have I'm calling you to interview you for the debrief, right?
Yes. Yes.
But I when that happens, what is the process that I go through?
Well, the process that leads to what we usually think about as post-traumatic stress disorder and similar sorts of outcomes has the same beginning as what leads to post-traumatic growth. Okay, that's one thing. Second thing is, let's not think about these things as alternatives.
Sure.
They coexist, all right? So what starts in the process that we've sort of adopted as the kind of understanding of what trauma is it shatters people's understanding of themselves or their lives or the world they live in. Something that they've always thought was true starts to be questioned.
Okay.
All right? And we didn't originate that kind of idea. That's something that we picked up in the psychological literature. Sometimes it was referred to as the assumptive world that becomes shattered. That's the assumptions we make about how things are, who we are, all of that, that we don't even question.
Yeah, the stuff that lets us get out of bed rather than crawling under our bed every day because we're terrified that something terrible is going to happen.
Yeah, it's what allows us to function in life. And we don't have to question it because it just is.
Yeah.
That's what we thought, but then traumatic events, what they do is they tell us maybe what we thought is not really so, because these events show that maybe it's not what I thought. So that's the first thing. And that's really anxiety arousing and confusing for people. They don't know what to make of it. They don't understand things anymore. They don't understand themselves, or they don't understand the world that they're functioning in. Their future, as they assumed would be, is no longer possible for them. It could be any of those kinds of things. They start to question how predictable life is, how controllable things are, how vulnerable they are, maybe their moral compass. This is where lately there's been a lot of attention to moral injury as an outcome of a lot of events for people, especially in the military or in law enforcement, because sometimes you have to do things that don't comport really closely with what you've always thought was the right thing to do. So all these questions start to come up, and people are having to sort through all that, which is really confusing and difficult.
Yeah, so you kind of create cognitive dissonance between what they believed before the event and what they believe now become disconnected.
Right. They're not sure now what to believe. It's up for grabs.
Got it.
And when it's up for grabs, the good thing is you have a possibility of understanding things better than you used to.
Sure.
Coming to a newer understanding of all sorts of things, which we can get into. So it starts out as really negative, but it doesn't have to end that way at all.
But it's you've taken a variable. I mean, you've taken something you thought was constant and made it a variable, and so now you are going to redefine it. And you can redefine it negatively, or you can redefine it positively, depending on the process.
Right, depending on the process. Right.
So I can be, if I am involved in an airplane crash, I can come to the conclusion that this was a one-off and it'll never happen again, and I can feel safe in the world, or I can never walk under, on, or near another airplane for the rest of my life and be terrified of them forever.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's or some of both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I go through this process where now I'm questioning some, or maybe perhaps, I think of like a law enforcement shooting. I mean, you're defining, you talk to guys that have been in traumatic events, and it undermines their confidence. It undermines their beliefs about their own ability to protect themselves, their ability to protect their families, their tactics. All of these things kind of come into question. What's the next thing that happens as I start that process?
Well, the next thing that happens is people start to think about this stuff repeatedly. They ruminate. They wonder, oh, why did this happen? Why did this happen to me? Or they wonder about what we call counterfactuals. That is, they try to counter the facts of what's happened with kind of wishes and say, oh, I wish it had happened differently. Or they start to think about how they could have done something different to prevent it or to have a different outcome. So they go through a lot of preoccupation with what has happened to them, and they can't get this stuff out of their minds, which makes them very anxious and distractible and makes it difficult to function. And so they start to kind of break down over that because they feel out of control of themselves and their own thinking. So it's really quite a mess. So their emotions become very dysregulated because now they feel out of control of their thinking, and therefore they think that they're weak or they're never going to be able to function right. Or it really snowballs into a lot of negative stuff. So that's kind of the first step in this process. It sounds bad, and it is. This is where you get the symptoms of post-traumatic stress or acute stress disorder or that sort of thing. All right. So that's kind of the first phase of this.
Okay.
All right.
So yeah, you're starting into almost. You can see where that's going to feed into itself too, right? My world has become more unstable. I'm not really trusting things that I used to trust,
Right.
and now it's all I think about, and I can't control my thinking. And because I can't control my thinking, then I'm maybe even more weak than I thought I was.
That's right.
And now I'm physically agitated all the time because I'm thinking about all this horrible
Yes.
shit. And then I can't sleep, which is then going to, like, you can see where this just becomes
Absolutely.
a cycle that feeds itself.
Exactly. All the things you talk about is exactly the way it happens for people. And like you say, it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy after a while when you start to think of yourself as damaged, disordered, and then too often somebody gives you a diagnosis that confirms that you're damaged and disordered, and you're not coming back from that. You know, people think about these diagnoses as, well, a life sentence.
Yeah, I go see an inexperienced, psychologist, psychiatrist, doctor, whoever, who says, oh, you have post-traumatic stress disorder, you're going to have this for the rest of your life. And my already hopeless mindset now is like, well, I'm just screwed.
You know, I remember talking to a fellow who taught at West Point, and when he was teaching the basic psychological concepts and things like that, he would poll his classes and ask people, how many of you think that you're going to end up with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as a result of your service? And almost all of them thought that that was what was going to happen to them.
You build a self-fulfilling prophecy out
Exactly.
of it.
Exactly.
Okay, so it strikes me that at that point you're in a pretty vulnerable state, and you're kind of at an inflection point. You can already see kind of setting up this, you're gonna get better from this, or you're gonna get worse from this. And initially it sounds like it's gonna kind of try to pull you down the drain. What's the next step in that process?
Okay, so let's talk about the inflection point then,
Okay.
right? So people start to, of course, wonder about themselves, all right?
Sure.
Which is really unpleasant in a lot of ways, but can be a good thing. So people do a lot of self-analysis. They maybe start to try to learn something about what they're going through. And that can lead to some steps along the way that might be good for them in the long term. Also, and this is something you know about very well, people feel compelled to tell what they're going through, tell their story. The problem is sometimes they don't have the right outlet, the right person to tell their story to,
Yeah.
or they've been told that they shouldn't.
Or they're put under a federal gag order for 5 or 10 years.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. But people would like to tell their story if who they told their story to would listen and accept and not judge them. So finding someone like that, when that starts to happen, this whole thing can change. That's the inflection point, all right? Now, in a lot of trauma-focused therapies, there's a thing about telling the story of what happened, the traumatic event. That's important. But too often, they stop there. They think that that's the end of the story, this traumatic event. And they try to have people retell the traumatic event over and over again until they don't feel too much from telling the story anymore, like habituating to it. All right? Unfortunately, that's not what's going to heal people. They have to then talk about what happens next. This stuff happened, told the story of it. Now what? Now you start having to deal with what's happened in the aftermath of this. And that's where we focus our attention, the aftermath of this event. What's going to happen going forward?
Yeah, because telling the story of how you got hit by a bus stops being interesting to people when the bus hits you. And so as you're telling the story to people, once the event is over in their brain, the story's done and they're not interested anymore. And so I can see where you would get into the habit of telling the story, you know, let's say it's a shooting, telling the story right up through the shooting, and then that's where it ends. And you're just kind of reinforcing the negativity of the event and never moving beyond the story.
Yeah, you're short-circuiting the process if you just stop there. And the person's life becomes defined by that event.
Yes.
In a negative way. All right. So we have to move beyond that to the next part and allow people to see that there is another part. There is a possibility. There is a future. And that's a future that doesn't define them according to whatever it is that's happened to them. And it may be one event. It may be a whole lot of events. It may be a story that includes things that happened in their childhood. It could be a lot of things.
Yeah.
Because it's a whole life story that we start to take a look at of what people have been like, how they've come across and encountered certain terrible things perhaps, but also what the future may hold. You know, what the next chapters of this story might look like.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Like, you know, if you grew up in an abusive home and took control of your life by becoming a police officer and overcame your childhood and then get in a fight with a suspect who beats you like you were a child, you're going to re-trigger all of that trauma. And now you're having to overcome the fact that you thought you overcome it and didn't. Right. It's going to completely just undermine the foundation of who you think you are.
Yeah. Because, for example, many people get into the military and law enforcement and whatnot because they've had difficult childhoods.
Oh, yeah.
And they've been told things about how they're not worth anything or they've been abused in some way or whatnot. And then they develop a way of living a life of service and doing something that they feel is a strength in them. But then in the midst of that somewhere, some things can happen that might make them wonder about themselves again. And, you know, that harkens back to the earlier times and those terrible messages and all of that. And so it kind of compounds, you know, all the early things, the things that are happening more recently, it becomes something very difficult for people to come to terms with.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not an event. It's an entire life arc narrative now.
That's right. Entire life arc narrative. That's right.
You can see where, you know, so, and as you're telling me this, I'm thinking to myself, like, you know, when people tell the story to friends, to families in debriefs, right? You know, very typically, I typically end my debrief with where are you right now and what, you know, how have you gotten through this? But most of the time you tell the story right up till the shooting ends. And so now, you know, you're going around, you're telling the story, you're being defined by the story. Now you're the guy that got hit by the bus. Mm-hmm. and you're not rich anymore. You're just the guy who got hit by the bus, and you tell the story to the point that the bus hits you, and like it literally, again, you have another self-fulfilling prophecy that your life is defined by the event, but you never move past the end of the event. It just stops at the event.
Right.
That's terrifying.
It is. So in order to move beyond that, hopefully you find some people who are going to listen to you in a different way, not just be engrossed in the stories of negativity and the terrible things that happen and whatnot, but paying attention to the possibilities and the strengths, capabilities, what's changing, something else that's maybe not well articulated by the person themselves, not even noticed by the person themselves, but you start to draw that out and point the person in the direction of, okay, that's not the only thing here. There's more to this than that. Okay. So, one of the things that we talk about, for example, at Boulder Crest, is that we try to get the message across that it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. It's not what's wrong with you. It's what happened to you. So if you carry a diagnosis of PTSD or something like that, it starts to sound like, well, something wrong with you, right? I mean, it's a disorder. You've got a disorder, something wrong with you. But we have to educate people on the fact that what they're feeling and what they're thinking, what they're doing is the expected result of being through terrible circumstances as a human being. So, just as you suffer a physical injury when you're hit by something physically, and we wouldn't say that you're disordered, you're injured.
Yeah.
So same thing psychologically. When you're hit by something psychologically, it's not that you're disordered, you're injured. All right?
Yeah, something happened to you.
Something happened to you. It's not because there's something wrong with you. It's because, just as your body is going to bleed when it's nothing wrong with your body, it's supposed to bleed under these circumstances. What's happening to you psychologically is supposed to happen under these kinds of circumstances where you go through all these things that I just mentioned. That's typical. That's normal. So we have to help people understand that they can view themselves as having been injured by these kinds of events, these circumstances, but people heal from injuries, right? And there's nothing wrong with the things that you're experiencing. It doesn't indicate that you're weak or that you're disordered or that this is the end of the story or any of that. It's just that, this is what happens to people when these things happen to people.
Yeah, you just got hit by a bus. It's perfectly reasonable for you to be concerned about buses.
Exactly.
And you have to now deal with the fallout
right.
from being hit by a
right.
bus.
But when you start to listen to people's stories from this point of view, where you allow them to see that you're not surprised by what they're experiencing, and you're not judging them for it, and it's understandable, they can relax a little bit. And this brings on the other thing. They start to relax into a different way of thinking about this, maybe being curious about it rather than upset about it or judging themselves for it. Instead being curious, so what's happening to me? So many times when I start to explain to people their physical and psychological reactions to trauma, and I put it up on the whiteboard and draw it out and things like that, just doing that, they say, so that's what this is about. You mean I'm not crazy? No, you're not. You're human, all right? They relax and they start to get curious about this whole thing they're going through, start to think about it differently as something they want to know about and understand. Not think about in terms of I'm weak, I'm no good, or whatever. None of that. So let me understand myself as a human being now. So there's that. And then we can also enter into some ways to help them calm the central nervous system part of this, where they're doing all the symptoms of PTSD stuff, easily startled or anxious, or when they think of the things that happen, they re-experience them in really negative ways and all that stuff. So we help them regulate their emotions and tolerate the stress better, because when they can do that, then they can work even more on what's happened and what they're really all about and where they're going to take their lives into the future to something that's positive and useful. So help them calm, help them think, and explore some more with someone who's a listener. We call them expert companions. People are companions through this, and their expertise is how to be a companion rather than someone who's going to say, you need treatment.
Yeah.
Or, you're disordered and we're going to give you this diagnosis and therefore, we know what's wrong with you and we're going to do this to you. No. You're still a person with all these capabilities, and we're going to accompany you on this process, this pathway into a future where we know you're not only going to recover, but you're going to change, because going through this changes you. You're not going to go back to baseline. You're going to change, and you can change in some ways that, believe me, you're going to value as a result of going through all this. So that's the pathway that we start to talk about.
It's funny because as you're saying that, like just the words you use feels like the difference between us sitting across from a table and me saying, look at what happened to you, tell me about this, or me putting my arm around you from your side of the table and saying, hey, let's walk through the story.
Well, let's walk through it together.
Yeah. And it's funny because, doing the debrief, interviewing so many teams that have had traumatic events, there are so many of the things that you're saying are resonating with the things that I'm seeing in teams that are going through trauma and are getting through it. And it is this validation. It's sitting with people who've had similar experiences who can say, hey man, this isn't going to define you. I've been through this. My life was dramatically different afterwards. Things can get better. Like I think of the conversations that I witness all the time, when we connect teams together. And you watch guys just go from wilted to blowering simply by the fact that somebody goes, hey man, you did the right thing and it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And it's like, as an alpha male, your brain is like, oh, that's stupid. But I've watched it work so many times, and I've watched it, you can see it reposition in guys' brains. And as you're describing it, I'm thinking of like, the event not defining you. You look at the guys that we look to now who have been, Nick Lavery or Justin Dodge, guys who have lost their legs, and you're like, well, their careers are. I was like, I interviewed Justin Dodge, and Justin's reaction was like, yeah, the fire truck tore my leg off. Like, okay, like my leg got torn off. Great. How am I going to operate with one leg? And it wasn't this mindset of I'm a victim and I'm destroyed. And like he was thinking about how he was going to work out on the way to the hospital. It's just that mindset shift to viewing it as something that happened to you versus who you are. And I really love the way that you position that, because it makes so much more sense when you think of it that way. From your perspective, from a best practices standpoint, so often when I talk to people that have been through events, what I hear is, obviously the first couple of people that they come in contact with really impact the way they feel about the event. Whether it's the chief of police coming to them and saying, hey man, you did the right thing. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. Or, oh, we need you to go in this room because we're going to conduct a criminal investigation now. From your perspective, what are those best practices in the way we initially deal with people and the way we deal with them after an event?
It doesn't make sense to think that in the aftermath of these sorts of incidents that you debrief people on, that before the incidents happened, we would think that they were such great operators, strong people, capable, reliable, smart, and all that. And then right after the event, we treat them like none of those things make any sense. Suddenly treating them as if they do the wrong thing, they don't make sense, we don't trust them. I mean, how could they go from being so strong and reliable and we trust them with such important decisions and all to people that suddenly we don't trust at all and they don't make sense to us, then that's crazy, isn't it?
It really is. And when you stop and look at it from that perspective, I put a machine gun in your hands 30 seconds before this event, and I sent you into a hostage rescue because I trusted you and then you'd be able to do it. And because you got shot now, we're going to put you on admin leave and you're not allowed to talk to anybody and we're going to treat you like a criminal and just go sit at home.
Yeah.
Because now you're a worthless piece of shit.
Yeah. That doesn't make a bit of sense.
No, it doesn't.
And so it's not surprising that when people are treated that way in the aftermath, that they have all kinds of problems because suddenly they're not the same person anymore. I've been told I'm not the same person. I'm someone that you don't trust, right? And you take away from them their purpose, what's meaningful to them. You isolate them from other people. You prevent them from working through what's happened because they can't talk about it. It's crazy.
And and their identity is already in a state of flux, and you're taking away what remains of their identity and you're taking away their tribe.
Yes, exactly.
So you lose purpose, tribe, and identity.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
In many cases, because you did the right thing.
Yes, that's right. So it's not surprising that then people have trouble.
Yeah.
Right?
You think?
Yeah. And then we blame it on them. Right?
Yeah, then we send into an inexperienced therapist who says, oh, you have post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
There's something wrong with you.
Exactly. Right. So we treat them this way. They have trouble processing all of what's happened to them. We take away what they've done best, so they can't do it anymore for some length of time or whatever. I mean, it's a recipe for disaster.
How do we not do that?
Well, one of the things that you were just talking about a minute ago is when you get people together talking about their experiences and comparing notes like this, they find out that, oh, I'm not the only one. Or you went through that too? Or that's how you think? That's what that's really powerful. I really think that group methods can be so important in this, getting people together who've experienced similar kinds of things. And just finding out that what they went through is universal. Okay? Yeah. It's human. Oh, so I'm okay because you seem okay to me and I'm like you. I mean, so these things can be really, really powerful experiences. So that's one thing. Getting people in a position where they can trust who they talk to so they can truly disclose about their experiences. That's crucial. All right.
Okay.
And then taking the chaos of it and organizing all that seems chaotic into something that makes sense for them. So you say, oh, I've been so confused. This is crazy. I've thought bad about me. No. Okay, now you're making sense. You're helping me make sense out of this whole experience. So when you intervene in these things, what you're really trying to do is organize the chaos. All right? Into something that's no longer chaotic, that makes sense, this can be understood. So now I can understand myself. Oh, I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy, chaotic thinker. No, I can make sense of this. All right? So there's all that. And then another part of the best practice is to recognize post-traumatic growth when it's developing. All right. So we talk about those 5 different areas of post-traumatic growth that our research has shown people report.
Okay.
So you watch out for these things. You watch out for people talking about deepening relationships, how they are getting closer to somebody, or they feel more compassion for people.
Okay.
They feel more connected with someone. All right. So there's that. They talk about appreciating life, becoming grateful for things that they took for granted before. Appreciating simple things in life, perhaps, but appreciating their own lives, seeing the value in living. All right, so that's something. Talk about new possibilities where they have maybe new priorities, new interests, something that they think is important to do. So look for those new possibilities that they talk about. Their personal strength, where they see themselves as maybe stronger than they thought they were. What they've come through that indicates to them that they do have strength. They're capable of doing things, handling things. And then spiritual and existential changes. This is where people start to think about living life as a meaningful and purposeful endeavor that they have to get clear about. Given the time I've got on this earth, what's the best way for me to spend it? What's going to be my contribution? How can I be of service? What's going to be most meaningful for me? Given the things that are difficult, why live through all that? Is there something that I can make of this so that it's not all in vain? For example, when you lose someone, on your team, do you want to live in a way that maybe honors their memory? Right? That could be meaningful when this person has died, but not in vain, because you're going to make sure that that's not the case. You're going to keep them remembered, and you're going to make sure that you live in a way that maybe is even better.
Yeah.
Because of their sacrifice. Something like that can happen for people. That's what we talk about, spiritual and existential change.
Walk me through those 5 one more time.
Okay, so we got personal strength, seeing yourself, your strength, your capabilities, your changed relationships with other people, deepened relationships where you can connect with other people in a different way. Perhaps because you've learned how to talk about your story, disclose, and somebody has listened to you with concern. So there's that. Appreciation of life, great appreciation of life.
Yeah.
New possibilities, new interests, new priorities, and spiritual and existential change, where you start to grapple with the meaning of life, the purpose for life, how you're going to live it in a way where in the end you don't have regrets, things of that kind. So those kinds of dimensions.
What is fascinating to me about that is, one, I see that happening, right? The guys who make it through the events that we debrief and thrive afterwards, I see all 5 of those things happen to them over the time that they're developing. But 2, and what I find most traumatic about that is the way that we treat officers that have been involved in a shooting or families that have lost a member of their family is we literally undermine all 5 of those things. We treat them like a criminal. We take away their identity. We separate them from their tribe. We take away the higher purpose that they were already feeling in their lives. And it's like you hear it described like that and you just think like, no wonder it goes to shit.
That's right.
Like we're literally doing the exact opposite thing of what we should be doing.
That's right. In fact, in some of our research we've looked at, we call post-traumatic depreciation. It's the flip side of post-traumatic growth. And that's what you just described. All these things can go negative. Your relationships with people break down. You see yourself as weak. All meaningless life. There's no possibility for you. Life doesn't have any purpose and meaning anymore, so you don't appreciate it, so you might as well kill yourself. All these things. There's that. And there's ways you drive people into that by how you treat them, just like you said.
Yeah. Man, it's just, it's so...
Talk about a criminal investigation. That's where it should be, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's we're going to do a criminal investigation. Let's do it on the way that we treat people. Yeah. And I mean, the number of teams that I have worked with and sat through with the debrief that you hear what happened to them and you go, and I say this all the time, and I'm sure you're probably saying the same thing. The majority of guys that I'm dealing with on the debrief who really have lasting effect of these events are more traumatized by the way they were treated by family, friends in the department than they are by the event.
That's exactly why we look at the aftermath of the event so much more than the event itself. Because the event itself doesn't have to be terrible for them in their lives. But the way they get treated in the aftermath of the event makes all the difference in the world. And that's where we put our focus, because that's where all the possibility is. Now, I want to make sure that there's something else so we're clear on this, and that is, because we move in this direction of post-traumatic growth doesn't mean that we overlook the terrible things that have happened to people.
Sure.
We don't sugarcoat all that. We admit that there's that side of the story too, of course.
Yeah.
And that people continue to have distress about that. It doesn't mean that they stop thinking about it or they don't think it was terrible or no, there's ongoing distress about that. But that distress can be what kind of helps them keep the edge of this growth because they remember these terrible things. And when they start to engage in PTG, post-traumatic growth, they can remember that this is what they're doing now to make that event something different than merely distressing. It's that event is a catalyst, and it continues to be a catalyst for what they do. Just like I was saying a moment ago, if you want to honor someone that you lost on your team, you don't forget about them. You keep remembering them, and you keep their memory alive over years, and that spurs you on to make sure that you continue to live well or do these things that are of service or whatever, however you defined the way you honored them. So the continuing distress is not a bad thing as long as it's at a level where you take it as a motivator for you to do well.
Well, and it strikes me also that it's not going to be a linear process, right? Like you're not going to be, I'm a 10 bad and tomorrow I'm a 9 bad. This strikes me as you're looking at the trend. Are we going in the right direction? There's going to be setbacks. There's going to be amazing days. There's going to be bad days. But, are you trending in a direction of growth?
That's exactly right. So this is something that happens over time. You talked about the guy who lost his leg and on the way to the hospital, he decided. But for a lot of people, it doesn't happen like that.
Of course.
It happens over a long period of time. And we talk about it, a struggle involved in this, that post-traumatic growth is a process of going through a struggle in the aftermath of these traumatic events that does lead to one or more of these 5 outcomes that I mentioned to you, right? So it's a process that involves struggle, having to think through things, figure things out, redefine yourself in some ways, redefine your priorities in life, all of that stuff. It's not an easy path. And there are setbacks along this path. Other things are going to happen to you too. This is the last bad thing that's going to happen.
Yeah.
There's others. But maybe when other bad things happen, you can start to think about them in the context of this growth-oriented mindset instead of the depreciation, the disorder, and all of that. And that will allow you to carry through. And the other thing is, there's a lot of talk in psychology these days in popular literature about happiness, how to become happy. And post-traumatic growth is not happiness. It's more profound than that because there's a poignancy to it that out of some of the worst things that have happened to you in life comes some of the most, come the wisdom that we started with, right? So there's this paradox of the bad and the good all mixed up together. There's the paradox of recognizing your vulnerability can lead to you also recognizing your strength. Because when you're clear on your vulnerability, you're in a much better position. People in the military know this very well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and if your commanding officer doesn't recognize vulnerability in terms of your position on the battlefield or your equipment or your training or number of troops, they're going to make some bad plans.
Yeah.
You better know your vulnerability. So vulnerability, knowledge of that, understanding of that can be a strength because then, individually it can lead you to connect with people that you can trust, to find help when you need it, to not go it alone. That's a strength.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's all these paradoxes that you have to start to think in terms of to get to post-traumatic growth. Out of your grief can come gratitude for what you have, what you've lost can allow you to appreciate what you've got. That's a paradox. There's all that sort of thing. The basic one as out of loss comes some kind of gain, something that you value. So being able to think that way is a way of understanding life because life is a mixture of all of that. So post-traumatic growth allows people to be wiser about how to live life, how to understand it. So that's part of this process that is a continuing thing. This post-traumatic growth is not a destination you arrive at. It's a continuing process of living, as I think you're suggesting here.
Yeah.
It's complicated, and it goes through all kinds of deepening over time, where you think you've kind of got it and you understand things, and then you realize, oh, there's another level. And you become more and more cognizant of how complicated life is in some ways, but paradoxically how simple it is too.
It also strikes me that this is not an intuitive process, right? Like, I think I recently wrote an article about low-level blast and cognitive, mild traumatic brain injury. And in the process of doing the research for that, and in the process of doing all the debriefs that I've done, I've come to this realization that we, especially as alpha males, but as human beings, we have this impression that our brains should just be an intuitive thing. We should be able to unscrew our own brain. We should be able to think our way out of these kinds of situations. We don't think that, you tear a cartilage in your knee and you don't go, well, I'm just going to think my way out of this, right? Like you go to a doctor and get your friggin' knee fixed. But there is this kind of counterintuitive notion that we have that like, oh, I should be able to think my way out of this. As you're describing this, it doesn't strike me that it's going to be intuitive. It strikes me that like we need to get help.
Well, yes. And, it's foolish to think that we have to reinvent this wheel. This is a very old wheel.
Yeah.
As long as there's been people, there's been trauma. And as long as there's been trauma, there's been post-traumatic growth. All right? You can look back to the ancients, the Greeks, the Romans, they talk about this. You find it in all religions, in all cultures. This is the human story of what do you do with suffering? So we don't have to figure it out all by ourselves. We can reflect back on what other people have written about this and what other people have experienced about it. We don't have to go it alone. That's the thing. We can rely on people who have lived thousands of years ago because they had wisdom about this, and people that are around us today.
But either way, we need to seek help.
That's right. Don't go it alone. Find an expert companion, or more than one, hopefully. People who can listen to you in a way where they want to learn what's going on with you, what happened. They want to learn without giving easy advice or platitudes, or just tapping on the shoulder saying it'll be okay, or I know you're strong, you'll get through it, or something that just doesn't allow people to get into the depth of things and to really talk about what they're struggling with. So finding an expert companion that really is going to listen and is also going to see in you the possibilities and the strengths and notice them and mention them and say, there's some things happening that you may not notice that I think are really important.
Next, I'm joined by Josh Goldberg, the Chief Executive Officer of Boulder Crest Foundation, a national nonprofit dedicated to helping first responders, combat veterans, and their families thrive despite trauma and stress. Since becoming the organization's first CEO in January of 2023, Josh oversees all operations and programs that have reached more than 100,000 individuals, helping them transform struggle into strength through pioneering applications of post-traumatic growth science. Josh's leadership at Boulder Crest has revolutionized trauma recovery through innovative programs like Warrior Path and Struggle Well. He's also co-authored 2 influential books, Struggle Well, Thriving in the Aftermath of Trauma, and Transformed by Trauma, that share these transformative approaches. Boulder Crest is a nonprofit organization focused on preventing and treating post-traumatic injury, and their work is truly making a difference in this community. Thanks for being here with me today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with kind of the origin story of Boulder Crest, because I think we've got to understand that to understand best practices.
For sure. Boulder Crest grew out of the work of a Navy bomb disposal tech named Ken Falk and his wife. And Ken, early on in the wars, spent a lot of time in hospitals with severely injured bomb disposal personnel. And he was watching them with this attitude that he couldn't imagine having in the aftermath of their injury, of like, they're setting goals every day, they're going to crush it, they're going to use less pills, they're going to be doing all these things. And he then started to meet veterans who did not have physical injuries, who were struggling in ways that he wasn't seeing at the hospital. And he really started to get curious about why was it that certain people thrived in the aftermath of trauma and other people didn't. And in the midst of that, we started to have dialogue with a range of mental health professionals. And Ken had opened with Julie, his wife, with Boulder Crest, the first privately funded retreat center in the country for combat veterans and their families, and started to go around and figure out what did we want to do with this place we had, and talk to mental health professionals to say what enables people who are struggling to live a good life. And these are serious, heavy hitters in the mental health world. And what they told us was that nothing works to help people who are struggling to live a good life, and that the best we could do is try to help them manage and mitigate the symptoms of their distress. And in the wake of that, of course, we have a suicide epidemic that's plagued this country for a long time, dating back to Vietnam, if not before. And we felt a little bit hopeless until we met a guy at UNC Charlotte named Rich Tedeschi, who started to describe the work that he'd been doing for a couple of decades in post-traumatic growth. And we looked at Rich and said, Rich, can we teach people who are struggling, who don't see hope, could we teach them to experience post-traumatic growth? And Rich said, I don't know if it's possible, but I'm willing to give it a shot. And that began this effort in 2014 to figure out how do you bring these practices and principles of post-traumatic growth to people in the world who are struggling. And importantly, because we now live in a world where people at police academies think they're going to get PTSD as an inevitable consequence of the job, is you got to get left to boom. You got to get in early and often and help shape the perspective of people engaged in work where they will be exposed to trauma, both professionally and personally.
So I mean, it's an amazing story. So walk me through kind of he figures this out and starts to build this thing, and like how does it take off? Like what happens?
So for about 6 months when we first opened, September of 2013 to March of 2014, we hosted other people's programs. We're like, okay, this stuff's not it. We meet Tedeschi. We start talking to Rich about PTG. And it's like, okay, we want to build a program based on this. And so what we had was a sense of we wanted a peer-based program where trust was the highest, and you got rid of all the bullshit of who did whatever deployments, whatever it was, and started to figure out how would we go about catalyzing people's curiosity and interest to understand PTG and just start to AAR the hell out of it. So we run programs. It started in June of 14, 3 programs that year, a bunch of programs the next year, late nights, long days, just trying to figure out how do we get this right with groups of about 6 veterans at the time. And by the end of 2015, we really felt like it all clicked. And we were like, okay, this is what it looks like. Brought in Rich, brought in another psychologist, Brett Moore, come in, and they said, we've never seen anything like this. In 2 days, you make breakthroughs that would take us at least 12 to 14 months. And what we're seeing in this sort of very active sport of what we're seeing in this active effort to facilitate post-traumatic growth is not something we could have foreseen, but it's something that's mind-blowing. And you started to see people come back to life. And I think you've described watching people go from like a wilted flower to blossoming is to see that in 2 days, to see the light come back into people's eyes, to see their posture shift, and all of a sudden realize like, holy shit, my life isn't over. And it actually is just starting was an amazing thing. And so we started doing that work. It went well. We did an 18-month study, make sure the stuff works, not just while people are with us, but for the long term. And then that led us to sort of rapid expansion of our efforts. So from about 2014 to 2020, we now have got 11 teams around the country that do our Warrior Path program, which is our flagship program for combat vets and first responders who are struggling. And then the question becomes, if you wait in these communities for people to get to bad places, to acknowledge they need help, you may be waiting too long because you're going to have suicide, substance abuse, domestic violence, all sorts of bad outcomes. You've got to get left. And so Struggle Well is our effort to bring PTG into the first responder culture, into the military culture, and say, how do we start to have a different conversation about this stuff early and often to catalyze people's willingness to do the things they need to do to live a healthy and constructive existence while they do these jobs, when they get out, but also if they encounter great difficulty, do they know where to turn? And have they already heard about some of these? You're planting seeds and so that people, when they encounter this stuff, they don't have to go through such a rocky road that we hear often, far too often.
Yeah, so hence the name, Struggle Well.
Yep.
It's not struggle well, it's struggle well,
Yep.
because you're going to struggle.
And that's the thing that continues to surprise me, having been in rooms with tens of thousands of people at this point, is people saying, I thought I was the only one. And I'm like, how could you think that? But I've been through, and I don't have any background in this world, in my own civilian world, with civilian life, been through a great struggle. And I understand struggle is so isolating. It's the most universal part of the human experience, the most isolating part of the same experience. You feel like no one will understand it. You feel broken. You feel defective. And one of the challenges, and you think about the tactical community, the special operations community, people who can do incredible things, highly competent people, believe that they can figure out life. And then all of a sudden, by the time they realize they don't know what they're doing, it's late. And there's a lot of shame in that and a lot of struggle in that, and acknowledging, like, my life's become unmanageable. I don't know what to do about it. And so for us, when I think about this Army research that came out in about 14 or 15, they asked people who had tried to take their lives that were unsuccessful. They said, why didn't you ever go to mental health? Because like 66% never went. And they said, we thought we could figure it out on their own. It's like, cool, if people want to figure it out, then teach them how to do it. It's not that they're bad at it. No one's ever tried to teach them, hey, life is this. How do we navigate this? And that's where really for us, PTG is all about, trying to get left to boom and having these conversations with people about life and how to navigate it.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're saying that, I'm thinking the very skill set that makes you a good cop, the very skill set that makes you a good tactical operator, the ability to handle complicated situations, the ability to take care of yourself, the ability to operate on your own, courage is counterintuitive to recovering, right? The fact that you are self-reliant and so strong is not helping you here, right? Like, it's the fact that your whole life you've been able to figure things out is not helping.
Yeah.
It's making you think that there's something wrong with you because you can't figure it out now.
Yeah, and you have that individual context, and you have a societal context, and all of the sort of diagnosable condition for every single mental health ailment, and you layer all that stuff together, and it's easy to see a world where someone who thinks they ought to be able to do something because they're taught to be self-reliant all of a sudden doesn't know how to do it, and in these cultures are now staring down the barrel of, oh shit, if I am struggling, it means I must have that thing, and that thing means the end of everything I hold sacred, and it increases the risk that they're not going to tell anybody, because they don't want to open that door in that Pandora's box that's going to then take over their life and ruin everything. And so we feel like we've made so much progress on like stigma and telling people to talk about it, but the reality is we haven't, because that's been concurrent to an increase in awareness about all these diagnosable conditions. And so now it's like, if I talk about it and I struggle, then it means I have some kind of a condition. And if I don't have a condition, I'm a psychopath, because I should be affected by these lifestyles. And that's the part where when I look at this stuff, it's like, my fundamental drive is we've got to shift the context of this conversation. It is the wrong conversation, and we are aiding the destruction of great men and women. That's what we are doing by having this conversation in the lens of diagnosability. And most things that people go through are problems in living. They just exceed our capacity to deal with them. They're not mental health conditions. And if we can depathologize our world, we can democratize mental health, we'll be in a much better shape. And that's been the focus of our effort since we started, and it'll be the focus of the rest of my life. And we got a lot of work to do, but I hope I live a long life, and I got another 50 years to go, and we can make serious progress on shifting this narrative, which is, it's a victim narrative. General Mattis said victimhood in America is exalted today. Jonathan Haidt said that the prevailing ethic in American society is what doesn't kill us makes us weaker. And I fear that stuff is creeping into the warrior class. And I think it is a tragedy, and I fear what it means for national security and the security of our communities, because I think we're destroying the strongest people among us by convincing them that they're going to be victims of the thing they love the most, which is their work.
Yeah, and I mean, you can see it in recruitment and law enforcement. You can see it in military recruitment. Like you see it in society across the board, right? It has literally become like the Suffer Olympics now. Yeah. Everybody wants to tell you what's wrong with them and how what they have is just so unique and they're so special. And one of the things that I frequently say to guys after we do a debrief is, I know you feel like you're unique, and I know you feel like, you're the only person that ever had that happen. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, you're not fucking special. Everybody that's been through this feels just like you do. I'm sorry if I'm taking the wings off the unicorn, but You're not unique. But we've come to a point in society where we are deifying the fact that you had such a traumatic upbringing. It's insane that's what we're doing. And you can see where part of the problem is nobody's teaching anybody how to cope with shit. We've gone away from the days when you learned how to deal with things. And in one of the slides I use when I teach the lessons learned from the debrief says, it turns out ibuprofen and bourbon are not the solution to every problem, right? And that's kind of where we are. And one of the things that made me want to have this conversation with you is this notion of like, not only are you going to use warrior path, like if you've been through a traumatic event and you're dealing with it, we're going to give you some tools to help facilitate that. But what I think is very interesting about Struggle Well is we're going to give you some of those tools before it happens. Talk to me a little bit about how Struggle Well actually works. Like what are you trying to accomplish in training people?
And I have two major goals in Struggle Well. One is normalized struggle. Every human being goes through struggle that we were talking about earlier. And I think helping people understand like these are the normal responses that we have to struggle. This is what we do when we struggle. Our thoughts go this way, our feelings go this way, our actions go this way. If that's you, you ain't fucking special. I'm sorry to tell you, just like you said. Yep. I've said the same thing many times. And then to normalize struggle and normalize growth in the aftermath of struggle. So there's this twin part of educating people about the impacts of stress and struggle and also educating people about the opportunities to grow. It's part one is normalization. And then the second is the democratization of support. So this idea of how do we upskill everyone's emotional intelligence about mental health? And I say that because, when I was going through deep struggle in my life, I was at a Dick's Sporting Goods garage trying to do something nice for my mom. And I called my best friend in the world and he said, "How are you?" And I said, "I'm not okay. Like, I'm scared. I don't understand what's happening right now, but like, I'm not okay." And he goes, "You should probably talk to someone." And he's British. And I said, "Listen, motherfucker." I said, "I am talking to somebody. I'm talking to the only person on the face of the earth I would tell this to, but you aren't equipped to listen or don't feel like you can. And we have to make sure people are able to listen and not get scared because they don't know how to say the right words because they're worried if they say the wrong words, someone's going to kill themselves, and just sit with somebody and be able to be that companion, that guide for somebody when they're going through it." And that's the other piece to us is if it's true that people want to figure this stuff out on their own, if it's true that most people are going to turn to people in their orbit, then let's increase the emotional intelligence of that orbit where people can then do this stuff in their lives and help support other people. So those are the twin objectives. The primary way we do that, and it grew out of Warrior Path. Warrior Path is this 90-day program, 7 days on the ground, 75 hours. It's going away. But when we come into the culture, it's like, okay, we know that these ideas of post-traumatic growth have great salience and resonance. The most common response we get when we tell people about it is, "Why the fuck has nobody told me this?" Yeah. All I've ever been told is how I'm going to be damaged and diminished. So it's going into the culture and doing 5 8-hour days, a 40-hour training program where we start to introduce these concepts of post-traumatic growth. Also, it's super important to say, delivered by peers. And those programs start with peers talking about their story, but not the war story of just all the bad shit that happened, but the whole story of their own experiences, their own learnings, their own lessons, their own wisdom. And you're starting to model to people like this is a space where we don't play games. This is a space where we don't wear masks. It's a space where we talk about our shit and we own our stuff. And we can do that without judgment and diagnosis and shame and all the other stuff is we listen to people. And so we start that and we just start to lay the foundation of, have you heard of PTSD? Of course you have. Have you heard of post-traumatic growth? No. We are going to spend the next 5 days talking about this, reflecting on this, and thinking about how we've been through it in our lives and how we can continue to grow in our lives. And it is a conversation amongst about 25 people at a time with 2 instructors where we are having that fluid, active conversation where people are learning about the impact of struggle, learning about the possibilities to grow, learning about what PTG is, where it comes from, what the elements are, and then starting to reflect on their life in that context. And when I said to you earlier, like the societal context is so important is, people will say to me like, "Oh, it's great. You guys get veterans together." I'm like, what? Like you get most veterans together, they're going to bitch about civilians in the VA. That's not inherently productive. Yeah. But when you do it in the context of like, hey, we're here to talk about hard things. We're here to talk about wisdom and growth. And all of a sudden you get to shape the lens through which people are viewing their experiences, one another, and how that works. And what you will find, and it never ceases to amaze me to sit in a room with people who know each other but don't know each other, who start to reflect and talk about really hard experiences in their life, most of which are personal, not professional, and find great peace in being able to do that and realizing they're not alone, that no one's casting them out of the society or the club because somehow they're so defective as a human being, or how could you do that as a parent, a spouse, whatever it is you just start to realize like you're a human being. And I think what you find is like self-acceptance and a lot of reflection and a lot of wisdom. And so that's what we've been up to. And we don't have like, our retreat centers are beautiful. And it's bells and whistles and horses and labyrinths, all these things. You go in, all you got some workbooks and 2 people and a couple of slides. And you see that people are ready for this conversation. And as I was saying earlier, the readiness more than anything was, I'm so tired of people telling me that I'm destined to be a victim of this stuff. I love this. I love this work. And I just need someone to help me find a pathway to not having to choose between my work that I love and my well-being, because that's what I feel like is my choice. And if I do this job long enough, my well-being is going to suffer enough that my spouse isn't going to talk to me or is going to divorce me. My kids won't have anything to do with me. I'll retire, be miserable, and then die 5 years later with a drinking problem. And we've got to have a better path than that. And so that's been our focus. And the key focus of Struggle Well is doing it inside of cultures. Like Tucson Police, as an example, is you're trying to shift a culture where you're creating a different kind of echo chamber where these concepts are being reinforced consistently. Because the reality is 80% of our thoughts on a daily basis are negative. Then you add law enforcement going through bad shit. It's natural to see how you get to a bad place and then layer in the diagnosable stuff. And all of a sudden, someone's just in a black hole of an abyss. And you have to consistently be able to remind yourself, like, yes, this is hard, and I can grow in the face of this or grow because of it.
Well, and it's also like nobody teaches us how to regulate our emotions, right? Like this is, I think, theoretically our parents model that. Not all of us had those parents. I certainly didn't. My wife certainly didn't. I think we are those parents for our kids, but that's because we both went through therapy, right? And so I think there is this kind of this notion that we should be able to manage ourselves. When I interviewed Rich, we talked about like this idea that like you feel like you should intuitively be able to just manage yourself. And so we have somehow negatively stereotyped and stigmatized mental health and the idea of emotion and management of emotion to a degree that is ridiculous. Every single one of us are emotional. We all have, 80% of our thoughts are negative, but we never take the time to go, hey, when this happens, here's how you can deal with that. And I think what's interesting to me about Struggle Well is the idea that we're going to take a bunch of grown-ass adults and put them in a room and talk through life, but also go like, here's how you help people to work through their emotions. Here's how you work through your emotions. This is what a healthy emotional conversation looks like. Because I don't know that any of us ever really see that until you're dealing with people that understand what they're doing.
Yeah. And there's 2 thoughts that come to mind. The first is we did a class for a SWAT team early on because we really wanted to test this with people who kind of have good bullshit detectors. And at the end of this 2-day program with the SWAT team, this guy looks at us and he said, you found our weakness. And I said, what's that? And he said, we'll talk about anything but the shit we haven't figured out. And it was like divorces and custody issues, mostly personal stuff that they were going through. Like 4 or 5 guys on the team were going through this out of 28 people, but they would never talk about it with each other because they never wanted them to think they didn't have all their shit squared away.
Yeah.
And it's like, what a toxic thing to do as opposed to leaning into one another and realizing you're not alone, you're not special, and there is support to be gained and wisdom to be gained from this experience. But the other thing I think about is, because you're spot on, is when we talk about best practices, one of the things we've worked really hard on is, hope isn't a strategy. So the idea of post-traumatic growth is wonderful, but it's only wonderful if you can bring it to bear in your life, is how do you operationalize this in a roadmap that is easy for people to do? It's hard work, but it's easy to understand what you need to do. And that is the process of Struggle Well or post-traumatic growth, which is built in a relational setting. So it's all about trust and connection. It's about being in a place where you feel safe in some way, shape, or form, that when you talk about this stuff, it's not being violated, it's not being judged, it's not being sort of taken out of turn and used against you. And that's why the peer-based system is so important to us to go into that. It's also what you do. When you bring in people from one SWAT team to talk to another tactical team who've been through similar shit, there's an inherent level of trust in there that you cannot buy, right? That's not easy to acquire or create. And when you have that, you're working through 5 phases of PTG, which is exactly what Struggle Well is. First is education, and I talked about this idea of educating people on the normal impact of struggle, but more importantly, educating people about the opportunities to grow in the face of that. The second is regulation, because it does not matter what you know. If when stuff goes down, your emotions get the best of you or flood you, you cannot apply what you know into what you do. And any parent who's been like tired or just frustrated knows that, because you know the conversation you want to have with your kid, but when you get short and you snap at them and the kid ends up in tears, you realize that your ability to apply what you know into what you do is limited. And figuring out what we talk about is how do you create a dimmer switch in your life? When you start to feel yourself rising up, how do you start to bring that down a little bit? Because ultimately, we're trying to slow life down. Like a great operator, like a great athlete, is how do you slow it down so you're responding instead of reacting? And Viktor Frankl is one of my heroes, wrote Man's Search for Meaning, the best book ever written. And Frankl said, in between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is where we get to make choices, conscious choices about who and how we want to be. And when you are really struggling and you're filled to the brim with stress, there's no space. And so you will react. You will say things you didn't want to say. And that will come out on, like we talk about, like police who are well will police well. People who have space can effectively adapt to their environment and can de-escalate situations. But if you're at a 9 and you go into a situation that's hot, that thing's going to 10. Like there's no way, you have no capacity to bring it down. And if you can do those two things, then you can start to reflect on, examine, and talk about the hard shit. Because you're doing it from a place of clarity, from calm, and you can begin to examine and start to make sense of the disorganization that happens to you. And that's like the hard work that we go through and struggle with. It's like, okay, why do we have to talk about it? What do we have to talk about? We need to reflect on our childhood. We need to reflect on notions of self-forgiveness, of guilt and shame, of the amazing Cherokee story of the two wolves. Is one of the challenges in these communities is you have people operating in no margin of error environments, and they hold themselves to a standard that is otherworldly, that is impossible to meet. And then you don't do something well, and you start to judge yourself, and you start to feel shame, and you start to withdraw, and you start to isolate, and start to self-medicate. Creates these cycles. It's like, listen, none of us are perfect. We're made of crooked timber. We have to find ways to acknowledge there are times we feed the bad wolf. And when we do that, we do certain things. And we've got to find some measure of forgiveness for ourselves for those experiences, or else we will eat ourselves alive. Like shame will put us into a spiral that we will never get out of. And we won't connect to people. We won't relate to people. We won't seek solace in other people. But that's like the hard work. It's like educate, regulate, disclose. And if you do those three things with consistency, the story of your life is able to continue to move forward. And being willing and able to share that story, which is at the heart of what you do, is of service, is of value, because your experience, your suffering, your struggle, the lessons you learned will be meaningful to some other human being, which means inherently they're less meaningless to you. Because now I went through this because someone else could gain. And like, that's the simple thing that took us, several years to figure out. And then how do you bring it to bear in a way where it lands, where people can hear it, where it resonates? And then they look at you and are like, I wish I had this 20 years ago. I wish I had this 30 years ago. This needs to go in the academy. What are we doing with retirees? What are we doing with spouses? And that's what, Tucson's the gold standard for all that, is just having a different conversation with people and reminding them, like you said, like, hey, we're human beings. We learn how to be human from each other. We've got to talk about this stuff and not pretend like we're robots or not affected by this. Like, we're meant to be affected by life. We're meant to be affected by the birth of our first child and the loss of our parents and everything in between. And how do we allow that to affect us in a way where we feel enriched in the process, I think.
Well, and come to the realization that the ups and the downs are life.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Like it's not supposed to be flatline. It's not supposed to be, constantly monotone. It wouldn't be interesting. And the highs mean something because of the lows, right? And the lows are what help define us, our ability to overcome those things. And I think that's what I think is so interesting about what you guys are doing is you're arming them ahead of time so that now when we roll in to a situation, you already have the tools, right? We're teaching them how to shoot. We're teaching them defensive tactics. We're teaching them how to write reports. We're putting them in these bad situations. And we know we're going to put them in these bad situations because we're teaching them all this shit for those bad situations. But what we're not doing is taking the time to go, hey, when that happens, here's what that's going to feel like. And here's what you need. And here's the support system that you need to build around you and how you use it. And I think that's what's really interesting, not only about Struggle Well, but the process, the partnership that you built with Tucson. And I'm interviewing Chad, their chief, but like that partnership I think is really interesting. From your perspective, tell me a little bit about kind of what you guys have done with Tucson.
Yeah. And I want to come back to the one thing I got an email recently from a dude at Fargo Police in North Dakota. And we went up there a couple years ago, and 7 weeks after we were up there, there's a guy went nuts on a traffic stop and shot up a bunch of people. He killed a cop. I shot this guy, and this guy was out of work for 18 months. And he said that if he hadn't gone through the Struggle Well training, he's not sure he would be alive because the tragedy would have killed him. But he said that he wore his hat. He got at the training every single day. And it reminded him, that and his faith reminded him that there was going to be something good to come out of this. And it was his responsibility to honor the brother and partner he lost, not simply mourn and end up in the grave with him. And it just reminded me, reinforced for me, like, okay, this stuff does work. Planting some of these seeds that someone can draw upon, because your brain can't pull from stuff that doesn't exist in there.
Yeah.
And so you have to plant those seeds. The Tucson example, which, like I said, is the gold standard. I mean, last year we trained 15,000 first responders around the country, primarily law enforcement in 28 states. And this thing has really grown, which just shows you the proliferation and the salience of the concept of PTG and struggle well. And we met Chief Kasmar, we met the Tucson folks, and they were going through difficulty. And there was two ways to describe it. One is they'd had a couple of really significant suicides on the force. There was some cultural challenges, post-George Floyd, all of those things which we know about. But the other was they had an early intervention program, and this is what the guy described. He's like, so someone pops hot on this program. And so the sergeants meant to talk to him and see what's going on, is why is it that he seems like his stress levels are elevating, which puts him at risk of internal discipline issues, external complaints, et cetera. And they call him in the office to be like, hey, dude, you good? And it's like, yeah, I'm good. It's like, all right, good talk. And then checks it off because they didn't have the capacity to have a conversation. And so it's like, okay, how do we upskill people where you have that person come in and sit down and be like, hey, what's going on? And they're like, nothing. It's like, no, like, what's going on? Like, we're not going to leave the office till we talk about what's going on because something's going on. And be willing to have that conversation that the person feels like they're not being interrogated, but they're being cared for, that someone's concerned about them. And so we started to do work back in 21 of run these pilots, these 5-day programs. And, you know, people had told, especially mental health folks, like, I just want you to know no one's ever going to say anything. It's like, okay. I mean, that may be your experience. Not people at TPD, by the way. But it's like, that's not been my experience. My experience, people are desperate to put their burdens down. And so we started to do it, have these conversations. And the intros, which is sort of the very first hour, started to go longer and longer. One of the questions in the intro is, what's one thing you're struggling with? And, you know, the BS answer is time management, like trying to balance all the things in my life. But people started to go deep early and often. And you just started to see this. And then there was this process where people would come through and then they would go home each night, start to have conversations with their loved ones that they had never had before about various items. And then they would go back and say, hey, I think you should go to this course. I think you should go to this course. And it started to just have its own momentum. And then it got to the place where it was like, oh, this is amazing. This needs to be in the academy. This needs to be for the FTOs. This needs to be for the sergeants, the detectives, for the leaders. We need the command staff in here. We need our retirees to have this training. We need our spouses. And it just had this natural momentum that was taking off where it became part of their culture. And, you know, one of the things that's always been important to me is that we focus more on what we know than what we do. Like, I don't want to be the guy who comes in and is selling our organization. I want to represent an idea as part of this movement around post-traumatic growth, which is really returning agency and control of people's lives back to them, that they're not a victim to a diagnosis or what someone else has said, and they can take the pen back and write their own freaking story, which isn't what they're being told. And so when you walk into the Tucson headquarters and it says, you know, what are you grateful for today? Struggle well. And they've got struggle well posters or signs at the academy. They don't say Boulder Crest on them because I want this to be something that is the culture of Tucson, that they own, not something that is being borrowed from us. And that part I take a lot of pride in. We are not about ego and logo. We're about changing perspectives and changing lives. And I think the most, and it's not just the chief, but leadership matters. And a lot of leaders outsource mental health to their mental health people. They'll claim they have lots of resources that they don't understand why their people don't use. But the reality is that people want to feel valued. And so when chiefs and leaders say they want to take care of their people, the question is, you know, are you willing to roll up your sleeves to be a part of that experience? Like, because to me, leadership is taking care of your people, not outsourcing that role to somebody else. And it's knee to knee, and it's being there with people. And that's what Chad and his entire leadership team embodies and represents. And kind of like a Belichickian, maybe Belichick's the wrong example, Andy Reid, maybe the coaching tree is, you know, one of Chad's assistant chiefs is up in Boise and he's bringing it up there. Another guy's in Spokane, he's bringing it there. You start to see how this spreads to other cultures where people realize that if you don't do anything, sort of PTSD/victim mentality will spread and is spreading.
Yeah.
And you've got to counter it in some way and counter the influence of that. And if you don't, you're going to end up with recruiting issues, retention issues, burnout issues, and just people feeling like they're dead men walking. And that doesn't behoove anybody.
Well, and it strikes me that, you know, you are intentionally setting about to redefine the culture of the organization.
100%.
And, you know, I teach culture-centric leadership. It's a culture is a topic that I've written on and read on for 20 plus years. And it is so much what controls behavior, you know, how you feel about the organization. And it is the thing that law enforcement has really let go of. We're promoting the wrong people, we're disciplining the wrong people. Like we've kind of created this thing where we're undermining the legitimacy of the culture. We're undermining the trust in the organization. We're undermining people's ability to communicate with one another. And so there isn't a tribe for them to be a member of. And this goes in and redefines the culture and reconnects the people, which I think is fantastic.
And that it's so interesting that you raise that, because certainly I think that's the primary objective, right? And you have to do that with the leadership, not like to the leadership, or just with permissive kind of allowance. And one of the things that I think about, like when we do this 5-day Struggle Well program, the last day is breakouts. And so we ask them to reflect on a few questions. One is, what resonated with you this week that you can bring to bear in your life and in your work? Second is, what support do you need to do that? And the third is, what does the culture need to do to be more aligned with these notions and ideas? And they come in and they present. And early on at Tucson, bring in a senior leader. This happens all over the country. Bring in a senior leader from the agency to listen, to just listen to what the people say. And one of the biggest challenges in the culture is not just disconnection or lack of trust, which are big, but it's also this us-them bullshit mentality stuff, which is like we're victims to the administration doesn't understand it and say, okay, but how do you reinvigorate people's sense that they do have agency and some level of control? Is you listen to people. And that doesn't mean you do everything they ask you to do. But like early on, you started to see people come in and share these ideas in this breakout. And the senior leader's listening and be like, listen, these are the things I'm going to take away because I need to reflect on and look at. These are the things we can do right now. Like, you want to wear pins on your uniform to struggle well? Awesome, approved. Got it done. You want tactical hats that you can use on we got it. And then these are things I can't do, but here's why. And all of a sudden, you start to create this culture where people come back to life as adults and realize that if they don't help shape the culture is going to shape them. And it's going to have its own sort of nihilistic way of operating where it's just more negativity feeding negativity. And that piece to me of creating a culture where there's ownership and where people are bought in is so important. And it's what's rebuilt trust. I mean, like I said, Kasmar's a great leader, came in, trust wasn't that high in any agency. And it's like, how do you rebuild it? Ask people and tell them we have an issue. How do we address it? And listen to them. And when you start to do that, you start to rebuild their sense that they're cared for, they're listened to, they're valued, and that they have a vote. And I think that's been an essential part of this journey. And when I think about culture, the greatest story of PTG in the world is the prisoners of war from the Hanoi Hilton. And in that spirit, the greatest leader, who was the leader in the Hanoi Hilton, these guys were in prison for 2.5 months, almost 9 years. They were, in captivity, tortured. James Stockdale. Amazing, right? Focused on building a culture where people felt they had a sense of agency, that they were still led. He was still in charge. But he created this culture where people realized that they weren't victims. And we talk about this idea like, the prison isn't 8 by 8 feet, it's 8 inches wide. And it's right here in our forehead. And these ideas, I think for me, is taking the lessons that they taught us and bringing it to bear is a big part of what I think we're doing, which is why it's so appropriate for the warrior culture. Like, the warrior culture is a culture that understands that hard things have value, understands that human beings are incredibly malleable. And it's like, okay, cool. Well, let's just train you to do these things. And if you're trained to do these things, you'll be good at doing them, and keep working from there and share what you learn.
Where can people learn more about Struggle Well?
So our website has a lot of resources on it and a lot of videos. So I'd say go to bouldercrest.org or strugglewell.org, which will take you to the same kind of pages. And there's a whole bunch of content we put up there we call it just the home of post-traumatic growth, where we've got a lot of content on there. There's also a book we wrote called Struggle Well, which is an audiobook and paperback versions. And if they want to bring us to bear at their agency, you can email strugglewell@bouldercrest.org. And we continue to work with philanthropy and others to be able to bring this to as many people as we can and change lives, change cultures, change organizations, and make sure that people can live great lives. Because for me, I said as a civilian, is I don't want to be part of a world, or I won't be part of a world where we ask people to do great things and difficult things, and that the cost of that service is the quality of their life. Like, it just doesn't work for me. And so our organization exists to make sure that people can live great lives in the face of stress, struggle, hardship, and trauma, and that's what we get to do. So if we can be part of that journey for people on an individual basis, organizational basis, we're here to support.
Well, and I think that is one of the things that's most unique about you, right? Like, there are a lot of people in this space who are for-profit organizations that are out trying to make money on others' pain. I think part of the reason I wanted to sit down with you is this notion that, like, this is a foundation, right? It's not a for-profit business, it's a foundation. You are providing these services because people are donating money, you're finding philanthropy, you're doing this for the community to help the community, not to get rich on the community.
100%. And it was very apparent, like in the heyday of defund the police and things along those lines, where cops are so unaccustomed to people doing things without strings attached.
Yeah.
And we've got amazing donors. I mean, Gary Sinise Foundation, Gary's one of the best human beings alive. He calls himself the Grateful American. He doesn't want anything other than, literally, he'll send a message and be like, go help people. That's what he wants us to do. And he doesn't want anything from anybody, doesn't need recognition, doesn't need a name check. The folks at First Nets and others, there are folks in the world who are incredibly grateful. Bernie Marcus, Arthur Blank, who are genuinely grateful to live in a country where people are willing to do what folks on the first responder side and the military side do. And they want to make sure that those folks have the same opportunities that they do to live a good life and a peaceful life and have a wonderful family and all those good things. And it does make life a lot easier because it's like, no, we're literally just here to help. And yes, we got people we got to pay and the rest of it but it's like, we're just here to help. And that's it. And I'll spin around. There's no string. And for me personally, when I went through deep struggle in my life, I randomly crossed paths with members of the veteran and first responder communities who saw something in me and helped me in their language unfuck myself, which is the first time I heard the term, but I'm grateful I did. And I wouldn't be alive if I hadn't met the members of this community. So I owe a debt of gratitude to the members of these communities who taught me much of what I understand about strength and courage and what it means to be a man and a good human being. And that's the best part of my life is every day I feel like I get held accountable to being authentic and to being the best version of myself because I have role models who have taught me that. And the role models are from these communities. And so my version of my life on a personal basis is like if I can ensure that members of these communities live great lives, they'll have the same effect on people like me that they had on me. And that's what'll change the world. One person at a time with people who are powerhouses who, when they're struggling, are radioactive and who, when they're well, can fucking, lead movements and move mountains.
Keep doing what you're doing, man. You guys are making a difference.
Appreciate it, John. Thank you.
Finally, I'm joined by Chief Chad Kasmar, who has led the Tucson Police Department since 2021. A Tucson native with a University of Arizona degree, Chief Kasmar brings over 20 years of multidimensional experience across key operational units, including the hostage crisis team, street crime interdiction, and internal affairs. His leadership portfolio includes successful transformation of the city's public safety communications department, where he consolidated police and fire 911 operations while improving staffing capabilities. Now overseeing 5 interconnected bureaus, Chief Kasmar integrates Harvard executive training with frontline experience to create a supportive framework for his team while pushing for operational excellence. I first met Chief Kasmar while working with a SWAT team, who strongly emphasized how effective the department's wellness programs, created in conjunction with Boulder Crest, have been. Under his guidance, the department has implemented a holistic approach that is building a much better environment and a much more resilient team. Chief, thanks for being here with me.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to talk to you because I've talked to the guys from Boulder Crest. I've talked to Rich. I understand the theory, but Tucson PD has kind of become, what they're describing as the gold standard for the implementation of this. And so I really kind of want to understand, what started you down the road to, I need to change the culture of my police department?
Well, that's a great question. I had time to reflect about my profession when I left it. And in 2020, I hit my 20 years on the department. I'd lost my dad. I'll talk about that relevancy later. But I had made the decision I was either going to be moving. I'd been the second in command for about 6 years, and I just knew I had outgrown that position and I was ready to do something different, whether it was become the chief of police, become a director somewhere else in the city, or just do something completely different outside of law enforcement. It was a tough last 5 years of my career. We went through George Floyd, and we went through a lot of different things within the organization, change agent chief, changed all of our policy, use of force. It was a very difficult time for the organization. And then I had the opportunity in 2020 to leave the department and go to the public safety communications department, be basically the comm director there. And it was that year that I was away in 2021 when 2 team members died by suicide. Stephen Cass was a young three-year veteran, patrol veteran, well-liked, big kid, had some stuff going on in his personal life, also was exposed to trauma at work, was involved in an officer-involved shooting where he didn't shoot, but he was shot at. He was right there, thought he had been hit. Lots of trauma exposure, undiagnosed, unpacked, didn't reach out to our department resources. And then shortly after his death, And you notice I said died by suicide, that he didn't commit suicide. That's intentional. And then a few months later, again, while I was still gone, a female sergeant named Amanda Voss, well-respected, 15-year veteran, 2 children, ex-husband on the department, brother on the SWAT team, really well-respected, meat-eating cop, dies by suicide. And come to find out, she had been really struggling with alcohol. And again, lots of trauma exposure to traffic investigations, DUIs, deaths, fatalities. And both of their rucksacks were full. So what I had time to think about while I was away was there's too much trauma exposure in this town. People think of Tucson as this sleepy old pueblo if you're born and raised there, but like I am, third generation raising fourth. The reality is it's the 33rd largest city in the country. We're a border city. We're an hour away from the border, 250 geographic square miles, tons of fentanyl, 50% of the fentanyl in this state, in this country is seized in our state. I mean, you name it, gun violence, traffic fatalities, crime, short staffing, low morale, poor equipment. I mean, but when I came back to the department, we had 200 Crown Victorias still 4 years ago. We still have 100 today. All the challenges that any police department in America can face, we were facing. And so what I recognized was like, man, if I ever got the opportunity to go back and be the chief of my department, we have a great department psychologist, well-respected, had been there for over a decade, 2 behavioral scientist sergeants who would back her up on officer-involved shootings, critical incidents. But 1 week in her resumes were like reading a war novel. I mean, I would read every time an officer does proactive work or a felony arrest or something that's worthy of media attention, they complete a resume. And what caught me was I would read these things and, we're deploying IFAC kits, tourniquets, sucking chest wounds, rushing people to the ER in our own vehicles, treating our own injured police officers, assaults, shootings. Last year we had 175 non-fatal skin-piercing shootings on top of 64 homicides, on top of 400 shootings where skin wasn't contacted. That's just under 2 shootings a day in town. I mean, that's crazy. A war zone. It's crazy. So what I recognized was when I came back, I needed to restructure. I needed to make an investment in wellness. But what I also knew is there was certain things that I had within my knowledge and skill set to do as I developed a new team. But I also needed a partner, and that's where the relationship really blossomed with Boulder Crest and the Struggle Well and Warrior Path programs.
How'd you find Boulder Crest?
I have to give credit to Captain Flores at the Tucson Police Department, who's a dual-serving member. He's in the Guard, and he's also one of our members. And he had worked with the previous leadership team to onboard the first Struggle Well class, which was in December of 2021, which was the month that I took over as chief of police. So I inherited this first program. It took about 6 months to figure out what that would look like for the leadership team at the time to be willing to bring this partner in. And once I got a hold of what the content was, what it was about, and heard the feedback from the staff, I quickly went back to the Boulder Crest leadership team and said, how do we do one of these a month? And the premise around it is it's a voluntary class. The foundation of it is post-traumatic growth, and it's word of mouth. And to this day, 4 years later, it is not a mandated class. We don't force people to go. It's really driven at a peer level. It started with just our line operational staff. It didn't include supervisors. It didn't include lieutenants, captains, assistant chiefs. We didn't participate in it necessarily as leadership team, and it just slowly progressed. And the beauty of the class is it starts with 25 strangers because we're considered a major city police department. We're in the larger scale police departments, have about 1,200 team members, about 800 commission. But when we think about trauma exposure within a police organization, you have to recognize record staff now watches real-time body-worn camera footage of our officer-involved shootings, of traffic fatalities, of all the ugly stuff we see out in the field. Your 911 call takers, your dispatchers, your EMTs, your firefighters, we're all exposed. Anybody part of the public safety team is exposed to trauma that the normal citizen or normal community member can just not fathom. And what happens is rucksacks get full. And we generally, those of us who have been doing this for 2.5 decades, we grew up in a culture where big boys, big girls don't cry. Go to the call, take the call, suck it up, do your report, go take the next call. We didn't have mental health resources. We didn't talk about trauma exposure. We didn't talk about our rucksacks being full. It wasn't safe to do that. And what we take is a group of strangers who are terrified to be there. Not so much anymore, but man, I'll tell you, in year 1 and year 2, when when the classes opened, and I now open those classes, there was a lot of blank faces. A lot of folks didn't want to make eye contact, a lot of apprehension about being in those classes. That's dissipated over time as people, it's become a culture shift and not just a class we take, but shifting culture. That's changed. But I remember in the early classes I would go in and I would open those up. So to see the class where they start on day one of that journey, and then through the content that they learn and the connections that they make and the reflections that they have, in their last day culminates with the deputy chief, the second in command of my organization, and the assistant chiefs going to hear from the class on what they learned and what they think we can do better as an organization and how we enrich in our lives through post-traumatic growth learning.
Yeah, it's so I found out about this. Like we are in touch because your SWAT team
Yes.
pulled me aside and said, "Oh my God, you have to see what our chief did," which is, I mean, I'm used to the conversation, "You have to see what our chief did." I don't ever remember it ending positively. And it was interesting to see at a cultural level in the organization when I went in to train the team, what their mindset towards you, towards the leadership team, towards the program was. Like, it was very clear that you had shifted the culture of the organization, which is really unusual in modern law enforcement.
It is. And, I won't take credit for that. I mean, I found the right partners. I put together the right leadership team. Some of those decisions were difficult to make, where I needed the right people in the right seats to help lead this effort. I think when I look at it, the leadership team that started this in 2021 and evolved into 2022 really created the space for the department. The crisis that we were living in created the opportunity for people to think differently about it. And there's a lot of great lines and parts of the book and the Struggle Well book, but one of them is struggle is inevitable. It's not personal, right? We all struggle. And I think, if you look at your social media, nobody's struggling on social media. That somebody has more money, they're better looking, they're sleeping better, they're eating better, they have less body fat, their kids are prettier. I mean, it's, we live in this world where everything's reinforced that you're less than, and man, like who do you confide in? Who are your 3 to 5? And so when what I love about the program, it's a common sense approach to laying out that, and I started, and I'll tell you, when the team came to me and they said, part of it is disclosing, sharing your struggles, your experiences, so that you can enrich in other people's lives and normalize that struggle. And they said, Chief, not only do we want you to open because you'll set the stage, but are you willing to disclose? Because if we think you disclose, instead of having disclosure on Thursday afternoon into Friday, we could shore this up in Tuesday, Wednesday. And I thought, okay, let me get this straight. You want me to stand in front of a group of team members, Tucson Police, Tucson Fire, Tucson Com, maybe some guests, because we bring in guests from other parts of the country other chiefs, other police leaders, other department psychologists, so they can see how our class is working. And you want me to talk about the challenges in my life. And I've had plenty, and I talk either about my mother and her 2 sisters and 2 brothers all being sexually abused by their father, and how that's resulted in unprocessed trauma that my mom's lived with her whole life. I talk about my little brother's addiction to opiates and how he lives in recovery, and I worry about that all the time, or my little sister's eating disorder. But the one that normally gets me is I tell the story about my father and losing my father to heart disease in a short period of time back in 2018. And at the time, by all accounts, my life was perfect. I had an amazing wife and best friend who I still have today, which is unusual in our field, right? She's obviously the lead point in my 3 to 5. I have 2 amazing kids. I was a second in command. A difficult job, but it was pretty young in that position and well respected. And I tried to buffer the organization as much as possible to achieve the chief's direction, but also think about how that would impact our people. And I'll tell you, when what life taught me in 2018, when my dad got pneumonia, which attacked his heart, and he went from a healthy 72-year-old to dying in front of me in the hospital with his family by his side, in a short period of weeks, was you're not in control of your life, right? So I'd processed all these things, and I've had all the regular things happen at work. I've lost officers. I've lost peers. I've had children die in my arms. Don't have a heart attack in front of me tonight, John, because I'm like 0 for 6. You're going to die if you have a heart attack.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Because I was planning, I'm going to go ahead. I'll skip it.
I picked the right side of the training academy. I've had all the same trauma exposures that everybody else has, but I had dealt with those in a way in my life where I didn't really struggle with those experiences because I shared those with my friends. I didn't internalize those things. But when my dad died, man, it was this like, what are you doing with your life? And I almost didn't go back to work as a deputy chief.
Yeah.
And it just didn't matter as much anymore. And so what that loss taught me was, through my father's loss, it's really enriching my life in the way that I look at it. And that's where a lot of the struggle well concepts come into play. So I share that story, and I'll tell you, we've had 40 classes. We do one a month. We're into year 4. They're going to keep going until we get everybody trained. And even then we'll have to continue to do maintenance trainings, and we can talk about other classes we do with struggle well content as well. I've not gotten through one of those Mondays where I open up without getting choked up and having to compose myself. And, I always wonder, and I joke with the team, because it's uncomfortable for them to see the chief of police.
Nobody wants to see dad cry.
No. And I certainly taught my boys how to do that when my dad, passed away. But I'll tell you, it's the most difficult Monday I have, and all my Mondays are difficult, but it's the most meaningful, because what happens is every class I get feedback that if the chief of police, the leader of our organization, can stand up and share his challenges and normalize the struggle, well, then hell, I'm going to share too. And it happens every time. And so I'm a morning guy. I'm up typically 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, and I look forward to every day I go to work to this day. And man, I walk out of there whipped. It's about a 45-minute, conversation that I have with the folks. But I'll go back to the reason it resonates is we are unpacking years of unprocessed trauma. We've deferred maintenance on our house for a long time, and I'm fortunate that I found a partner that had the expertise. I knew enough to know I'm a creative problem solver, but I'm a cop, and I don't know enough about how to unpack all of my staff's experiences. And it was so critical because early in 22, just when we had restructured the department, I created a wellness division. I invested resources. I restructured command. I made sure that wellness was right in the same bureau, in our same executive bureau, that internal affairs, and the PIO, and all those critical things that report up to a chief, but also wellness reports now up through the second in command to the chief of police. I had put all those things in place. But it takes time. Culture shift takes time. And within that, I lost another friend to suicide in 2022, Chris Fidolio, who was a well-respected canine officer who had to medically retire because his rucksack got full. We didn't know what post-traumatic growth was back then. And he became addicted to NyQuil. And we worried about Chris when he separated from the department. He had been in numerous officer-involved shootings. He had had his canine partner killed. He had was involved in a fatal car collision. I mean, you name it. This guy was out there. He was a cop's cop, and he was exposed to untold traumas. And his rucksack got full, and we couldn't help him, and we didn't have the skills and the resources that we have now. We didn't have the culture, and so he suffered silently, which caused a struggled marriage, and it caused him to medically retire. Well, in his afterlife, he became a security guard in a security guard type function with a couple other TPD folks. And one day his rucksack got too full, and he took his own life at this other job in front of 2 of his retirees.
Jesus.
And at first we actually thought it was an active killer type situation. And I responded to that scene. I was eating dinner with my wife and my youngest son when that happened, and I responded out there. And I remember kneeling by Chris and just making a promise to him that, whose kids and wife, I grew up with, that we had failed him, but we wouldn't fail anyone else. And in 4 years, we've had 10 individuals, just under 10 individuals, come forward in different levels of crisis. One who had an active plan and was on their way to take their own life, but stopped and called us And all 10 of those individuals have been stabilized and they're back to work. And that's the best thing that I can do for Chris's wife, Bryn, and his 2 children that he left behind. And you notice again that I said died by suicide, didn't commit suicide. This is not suicide prevention training, and I open every class with that. That's too low of a bar. I used to talk a lot about resiliency till Josh beat that out of me too. It's too low of a bar. There's too much trauma exposure, and struggle is inevitable, and you're going to have your rough days, whether it's a difficult call for service or I disappoint you with some kind of chief, organizational change you don't understand, which I had to do last year to make organizational changes to address the level of violence we were facing, or you don't get a promotion, or you name it, right? Infidelity, marital challenges, all these things happen to you. And I would say we've done a great job, but there's no destination to culture shift when it comes to mental health and wellness of public safety folks, because the challenges are going to continue to change. And we have to recognize that we've underinvested in this space for so long. It's going to take us a long time to catch up. So what I would encourage anybody who's listening is, if you have a chief or you have leadership that you don't think would be open to bringing a post-traumatic growth program, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Strugglewell or Boulder Crest, you can find another partner. That's the partner that worked out well for us and I inherited and I'm blessed to have. But there are other folks in this space who do this training. You can still pull together regional training efforts, right? It's still high quality training that can impact and change and shape lives. True culture shift can only happen, though, when you have an organization from the top down that's ready to rethink the way that we do work, rethink the way that we apply discipline, rethink the way that we treat people who are in crisis. You don't have to have a department psychologist and a wellness division to make all this work, but you do have to have a commitment that when folks make missteps, or when there's undesired outcomes, as a chief, as a leader, you have to think about, why did that happen? What's the driving behavior? And recognizing we employ human beings. And so as a chief, it also comes from me putting my job on the line. So when a team member makes a mistake, I'm not on the media selling them down the river because I'm under some political pressure along with my elected officials and mayor and council. And I have to say, I couldn't have done this without city leadership, first in financially investing and creating space and trust that I could, launch a program like this and it would be beneficial to the organization as a whole, not just the police department, but the city of Tucson. So here we are 4 years later. We have a lot of work to do. I'll focus on the key concepts is obviously the foundation is post-traumatic growth, but it's a pyramid around physical wellness, mental wellness, financial wellness. We all know cops love our toys, and that's one of the ways we're going to cope. And in the middle, so again, physical, financial, mental, and in the middle of that triangle is spiritual. It's spiritual not in, who your God is, but what is your sense of purpose? We lose, when we get desensitized because we don't unpack the trauma that we're exposed to, we don't see humans as humans. And I love talking to anti-police groups and defunding movement groups. And, I tell them like, hey, what would you, the only thing I know that we do better of when we do less of it is lose weight. But if you want to cut my budget or, that's not going to result in my lack of ability to invest in my team members so that I can unpack the experiences that they have. That's how we're going to result in better community service. And the cool part is my primary focus with post-traumatic growth and Strugglewell was not to enhance service delivery. That was far from it. It was really to take ownership of, and I say this to every class, I'm sorry, you have not been invested in. And I have to say that less now because that was what I said 4 years ago. And now we've done a really good job of it. But in those early classes, I said, hey, we failed you. We failed to give you the tools. And I took ownership as a chief because I contributed those even as a second in command. We had some high profile terminations that were tough. That was the decision the chief had to make at the time. But now I'm the chief and I get to make those decisions. And we've had some really difficult use of force cases, but if you do a quick Google of us, you're not going to find any salacious terminations, where I was selling the staff down the river. And that's the evolution of the profession. In a world where major city chiefs have a 2.5, 3 year lifespan, it's a difficult thing we're asking everybody to balance. We're asking historically hardened police officers who haven't been invested in, who haven't had their rucksacks unpacked to now come in and feel safe and to share their feelings. That's a difficult thing to do. And I think that we have to recognize that. And so in my organization, it works well that I get to open up those classes and set that example, take some ownership of things that haven't gone the way that they probably should have, and tell them like, hey, we're all human and we're going to figure this out together. And that's really what's shifted culture at the Tucson Police Department.
What I love about this is there's so much talk about brotherhood. There's so much talk about, police officers being out there doing the right things, but we've created an environment where we're no longer able to talk to each other because if you tell me something bad, well, I've got to do something about it. And so many chiefs feel obligated like, oh, this guy's fucked up. I've got to get him out of my organization. I'm not going to try to heal him. So there's an incentive on the part of the staff to hide what's actually wrong. And although there is talk about brotherhood, there isn't a culture of support. Mm-hmm. And it all starts with leadership, right? It starts and ends with leadership. And I've said for years, like part of the problem we have right now is we are promoting leaders who have never made a mistake in their career. And when they do make a mistake, we get rid of them, right? We've got this mindset of like, well, Chad screwed that up, so we got to move him out of the organization, or we're not going to promote that guy because, well, he worked narcotics and he shot somebody. Yeah. And it is absolutely moronic to think that, like you and I are both at an age where it's like, I've made a fuck ton of mistakes. Yeah. Right. And now as a business leader, I am so much better at this than I was 25 years ago because I've tripped and fallen on my face so many times. So the idea we're going to promote you when you haven't made mistakes is the idea that we're going to promote you when you don't have the skills to actually lead.
Yeah. I would encourage, part of that is having a discipline guide that dissects mistakes versus misconducts. It is, here's what another conversation I love to have with defunders or folks to educate them about our profession. 10 years post-Ferguson, tell me how our training curriculum across this country has changed.
It's been defunded.
It's been defunded, or let me answer the other way too. Yeah. It hasn't been enhanced. Yeah. It's
gotten worse.
It's still 9 months of training. In 9 months of training, we take if we're talking about males, which predominantly our workforce is made up of, right? And their brain, we know based upon science that their brain is not fully developed for the next 5 to 6 years after we hire them. Yeah. And I'll tell you another little tidbit. Most of them don't go out and get their driver's licenses when they turn 16. Now it's 18, 19, 20. Yeah. So we teach them to drive. We teach them defensive tactics. We teach them case law. We teach them constitutional law, city codes, de-escalation, all these cultural competency, all these different things in 9 months. And then we give them a gun and a badge and a camera and responsibility. And we say, hey, go out there. Good luck. Don't make any mistakes.
Because if you do, we're going to charge you with a crime and we're going to throw you under the bus.
Which happens, right? Yeah. Which happens. And so what I tell people is when this world is designed around Navy SEAL teams are probably the best trained in conjunction with our SWAT operators who don't get to train as much as Navy SEALs if they're not a full-time SWAT team. But let's use Navy SEALs, NBA, NFL, professional athletes. They're training at least 95% of the time and deploying 5% of the time. Most cops in America, including at my department, are deploying 95% of the time and training 5% of the time. And I sit here today with a workforce that 40% of them have less than 5 years on. Now, crisis or opportunity, maybe a little bit of both, but they're more moldable. So the cool part is through the feedback of our senior members of man, great training. I've heard everything from good training, life-changing. Cops hate two things, right? Yeah. The way it is and change. Yes. Not one person has said this was a waste of my time this week. Not one. Not with over almost 900 people.
That's a miracle.
That in itself is a miracle because a healthy cop is a complaining cop, right?
100%. Yeah.
And so when we look at these things, we have to recognize, man, we're such an underinvested profession because you can't go install a water heater or an air conditioning unit or electric in a house without 2 to 4 years of mentorship and training. So why is it in this country that you can't do anything with a 2-year associate's degree in this country? That's going to make a living, right? And you struggle with a 4-year. I was at a class the other day around MLK Day, a community conversation, and I said, you know what's interesting? Everybody who spoke before me today had the word doctor in front of them, except me. Mine was chief. The rest were doctors. I said, you are one of the most highly educated groups I've ever spoke with to a community group. I said, we should think about the fact that you've all been and had 6 to 8 years of education, and my officers have 9 months, and look at the expectations, and none of you are wearing cameras today. we have to think about.
Well, and take it one step further.
Yeah.
Doctors practice.
Yeah, trust me.
Doctors practice.
Yeah, I wish.
This is one that is always a point of rage for me. Like
Yeah.
doctors kill way more people than cops do every year.
Well,
we go, oh well, he's practicing.
my dad's doctor didn't have a camera on the day my dad died.
Yeah.
So and I use that analogy. So I just shine light to our profession that I'm so proud of it. It's always been noble. That's what's drawn me back. I don't have to do this. I have other interests. Any effective chief has to be able to retire the day they take the job on. And, I'm going into my 4th year. I have, a lot of support. There's a 3-legged stool for chiefs, community, city leadership, and your team. And if you lose any one of those, you're not effective in the role. And I think we're trying to balance that. I'm not a perfect chief. We're not a perfect organization. In fact, my staff, we're probably the poorest major city police department in America. Worst funded. We have a poor community. We have some struggles. We actually have a sales tax vote tonight that's being defined tonight that will define our future, and a lot riding on that. But my team, I'm so proud of my team. They have every reason to be disgruntled, to be angry, short staff. They don't have the best equipment. We ask a lot from them, high levels of violence. I ask them to continue to be a learning organization and malleable to change, because that's the new world order, right? We have to try different things, evaluate whether they're working or not, and adapt. And that's not easy to do. No human being likes change, and including our profession. And I couldn't be more proud the way that the team continues to respond. But they respond largely because we've made an investment in them. And that's what post-traumatic growth is about. That's what Struggle Well is about. That's what the culture shift is about.
If you were speaking, and I know that you're doing this, but if I'm a chief of police and I'm listening to this, what's Chad's here's where I would start if I were you? Like your lessons learned from implementing this program.
Yeah, you need to learn to struggle well first, right? The chiefs do. Pick up the book. Learn, educate yourself about post-traumatic growth. Again, it doesn't have to be the Boulder Crest pathway, but start reading and educating yourselves about it. Your staff, with the amount of overtime, the amount of exposure, there's no department in America that doesn't need enhanced mental health support and services. We have to move away from this idea that why is it if you're on the SWAT team or you're out in patrol and you pull your hamstring on duty, we might have to put you on the desk for a week. You might have to go back to the city doctor and get you stretched out, or we're going to do very systematic things to get you back to work. Why do we still have this stigma that if you injure your brain, you're exposed? It could be an isolated incident, or it can be cumulative, right? Exposure. We don't know how we're going to respond or when it's going to trigger that response. But every police leader in America, every fire chief, every comm director has to start thinking about how are you investing the skills and the tools so when we have those setbacks, your team members have the resources they need to be successful and to navigate those things. It just makes the struggle more manageable. There's no panacea. And this, again, let me just say it one more time. This is not, one of my worst fears, and we do a lot of things to reinforce this, is you cannot go to this class and be inspired this week and walk away and not pick up the practices anymore, or it won't work. It won't work. It's just like having a healthy diet. It's like any goal that you set takes continuous work and improvement. But the cool part about it is the program also recognizes we're human and we're going to fail. So, if you eat like shit today, or you have a bad day today, you're a jerk to your wife, you're a jerk to your husband, you're a jerk to your kids, you just weren't in the right mindset for your shift at work, and you get a complaint, tomorrow's another day. You compartmentalize, you evaluate, you go back to your studies, you go back to your triangle, you go back to your goal setting, you go back to your 3 to 5, you go back to your disclosure so you don't keep that in your rucksack. And the best thing that I like about the program as well is you form a reputation so fast in this culture, in the policing culture. And I suspect it's the same way for a firehouse where you're living with people. And it's certainly, I can tell you, maybe even worse than a comm shop where there's no windows and they're together 12 hours a day, right? And there's no closure there because everything they're doing is through the phone. And I think that sometimes is even worse. But when we think about our jobs and we think about what we signed up to do and the mission of all of our organizations, what the last 10 years has shown us, and the data on the Officer Memorial Down page shows it, is we're not doing enough.
Yeah.
it's still the number one killer of police officers is suicide.
Yeah.
And that's mental health. And every chief, to put a bow on your question, has a responsibility to figure out what unique way, how they're going to do that within their organizations. It doesn't matter how small. It doesn't matter how big. Every chief in America has responsibility. And I'll tell you, I'll give you listeners hope. The group of chiefs that sit around Major City today is very different than it was a decade ago. And I've been going to that conference for 10 years. The same thing holds true for Arizona Chiefs of Police Association. So most of the police leaders that I interact with at this point of our profession see a deep calling to invest in our profession and get it to where it needs to be at the end of their careers. They don't have to be doing these jobs. They saw it not work the last 5 to 10 years, and nobody wants to walk away from the profession feeling like we got kicked to the corner and there's not recognition or appreciation for the sacrifices that all of our public safety team members make. And so I hope that gives some hope, to listeners to your podcast who are going, man, I just don't see it in my chief. Okay, well, just like I talked to somebody, an officer today, you're a senior officer. I don't want to hear out of your mouth that you don't have influence in your department. You have just as much influence as I do as a chief of police. And so you have to think about that. How do your senior officers, how do you expose them to a program like this? They're going to help you scale that program. You don't have to drive it as a chief. Your senior, well-respected officers. I had a 33-year officer, patrol officer, which is really an outlier in today's world of policing. He spent 33 years on the south side of Tucson serving a specific community, one of the most violent parts of town. Grew up there, served there. His daughter just hired on. He just retired. We were at his ceremony this last Saturday, and a retired detective came up to me and he said, what you've all done in the Struggle Well and Warrior Path program saved my life. He said, I lost myself. I was coping with alcohol. My marriage was falling apart. I looked in the mirror. I didn't know who I was anymore. And he was ready to die by suicide. In fact, he told his wife when he packed his bag to go down to the Warrior Path experience, he said, if this doesn't help me, he goes, there's nothing that can help me, and I don't think I can live anymore. And it was a combination of things we had done at work, presetting him with the Struggle Well content, and then the Warrior Path, and it clicked. And he's been sober for 3 years. He's healthy. He's happy. He's with his daughter. When I saw him Saturday, the marriage is back intact. So I'll close with, you can redefine your future, right? Your past doesn't dictate what your future holds. And in a culture where we're often defined by a reputation that we create in an academy setting, every day is an opportunity to define who you are and to level set and set goals. Post-traumatic stress disorder is not a jail sentence for public safety who choose to risk their lives and expose themselves to traumas. Post-traumatic growth provides a pathway to enrich in your life based upon those traumatic exposures, whether they're in your personal life or whether they're in your professional life.
Chief, thanks so much for sitting down with me. This is amazing.
Thanks for having me.
One of the unintended consequences of hosting the Debrief is that I'm constantly immersed in trauma and the lasting effects it has on responders, victims, and their families. This is an area where it is clear that we can do better. The wreckage we are leaving our warriors and first responder with after they sacrifice themselves is just unacceptable. When police officers are more likely to kill themselves than be killed in the line of duty, we are doing something wrong. Hopefully today's discussion has lit a fire for you to take a deeper dive into this area. We've included a number of resources in the show notes. If you are struggling with PTSD, please know that there is a path out of the darkness. Whatever your source of trauma, there are treatment methods that work and will allow you to emerge stronger than you were before. Please seek help because you deserve to be happy.